This program is brought to you in part by City Winery.
So welcome back to Books du Jour. We have a new panel of crime-related writers. Let me introduce them to you. I'm going to start with, Henry, but with women's first. Maria Konikova, mastermind How to Think Like Sherlock Holmes. Let me tell us all about it. I have Karin Slaughter, was On Sin, which was the book last year, correct? And then Criminal came before that. Mm-hmm. What's the next one?
Coptown.
Coptown. And I have Henry Chang, Death Money. And we tell all about the superstition in Chinatown. Maria, I was very intrigued by your book because it's very different. I've never read a book like that. When you sort of mix psychology and sort of crime investigation, how did you decide to go into that path?
Well, you know, my background is both nonfiction and fiction, so I wanted to kind of write something that married the two, that used my love for Arthur Conan Doyle and for kind of detective stories and for Sherlock Holmes, who doesn't love Sherlock Holmes, to explore the human mind and the ways in which we can maximize our thinking power so that we can become more like Sherlock Holmes, which I think everyone would want to do, at least as far as the thinking is concerned. Yeah. Emotionally, I don't know if we'd want to be like Sherlock Holmes. I do think that Sherlock Holmes is kind of a thing of its own. I've been asked before, who's the modern day Sherlock Holmes? And my answer is that he doesn't exist.
So when you say that Sherlock doesn't exist, why is that? Is it because it's the investigative methods are completely radically different?
I think it's because he's a very specific type of detective, and there are other amazing detectives in literature throughout the 20th century. Mm-hmm. I just don't know that I would be able to say this one is the modern day Sherlock Holmes.
Do we have a different mind? Yeah.
No, I think that Holmes is incredibly relevant in the modern day.
Karin, was he ever an inspiration to you for your writing?
Well, yeah, I think that she's absolutely right. There really is no modern Sherlock Holmes, but we do have technology now that sort of gives us that Holmesian deduction. Detectives are really trained now to spot the different things that cue us into a liar. Mm-hmm. You know, touching your face or, you know, temperature of your body, that's the breathing. Mm-hmm. And so we have lie detector tests. Yeah. And so I think that we're trained to be Sherlock Holmes in different ways, but with a vast support system of technology.
Yeah, what's your background? Because I read your book and your writing is very precise. I mean, the description you just gave is about how you write. You're very nuanced in emotional intelligence, I suppose.
My background is absolutely not prepared me for any of that, though.
Never
I'm a curious person. I think that as a writer, it's important to see how different people live and get out of your comfort zone. That's one of the things I worry about with technology today is, you know, if you want a certain type of news, you go to a certain website. If you want a slant on things that agrees with you, you can really find it. Yeah. So I think as a writer, my constant challenge is to look at how the other side is thinking and really understand it and write about it in a way that isn't looking down at them or dismissing them out of hand because they don't think about me.
Yeah. Henry, the Sherlock, was it big, especially in the Chinese community?
I'm not sure how much Sherlock resonates in the Chinese community, but
for you,
I agree with the the advances in technology, forensics today, surveillance, shows like Person of Interest, shows us really how the investigative techniques have really changed. So, I agree there's no Sherlock today, but there are really bright people who backed up with all this technology and techniques.
Yeah. Karin, how do you come up with all the stories?
Mostly I steal them from country music.
The songs?
The songs.
Okay.
You know, there's a lot of passion in there, lots of murder and cheating and blame shifting and that sort of thing. So, but I think you raised a really good point about how technology leveling the playing field. I think emotionally also we have a more level playing field. 40 years ago, even in the 1970s, they didn't really have an understanding of the criminal mind. And one of my books, Criminal, I talk about Atlanta in the 1970s and the police force. A future book of mine that comes out in the summer is called Cop Town, and that also is about the 1970s. And one thing I found is just how emotionally ignorant they were. A typical call out where a young girl had been molested, for instance, they would just assume that she was lying and she wanted it. And, you know, all these things that we kind of think about now, and it's really gross, but they didn't really understand why people committed crimes. They were much more concentrated on punishing people. But you can, as a crime writer especially, talk about this and hold a mirror up to society, because I think that's something that a lot of people don't think about. I mean, we can all agree that a 12 or 13-year-old forced into prostitution is a horrible thing. But when this person reaches 18, 19, 20, we suddenly don't care about them anymore and we think they've made a choice. So that's the sort of thing I think that crime fiction has always taken on. I mean, whether it's Sherlock or even Agatha Christie, we talk about what's going on in the world and we try to show it for what it really is.
Yeah, so your main character is a man, and he seems to have a very loaded past. How can you get free from that if he's constantly interacting with the bad stuff of life?
Well, that's one of the things I love writing about, because I do think that people can transcend their backgrounds. I'm very interested in people's pasts, and that probably comes from my grandmother. When I was a child, she would take me to church and she would introduce me to people, and you know, she would say, "This is Mrs. Smith or Mrs. Jones," and as soon as the woman turned around, she would say, "Well, you know she's a drinker," or "You know her husband's cheating on her." So I grew up thinking everybody had these deep, dark secrets. For Will, my main character, he made a choice when he was 18 that he was going to be a good guy.
So what is that secret power that he has?
But for Will, you know, he does have that genetic advantage where there's some wiring in his head that makes him capable of understanding that there's a different way to live his life. But then he also has people in his life, some of them he doesn't know about, who were there to steer him in the right direction. And, you know, it's just that combination of having good people who will take care of you and, you know, being raised in the right way that I think that gives you an advantage.
So let's talk about the brain wiring. What would Sherlock say about such a character?
Well, I think Karin was absolutely right when she said it's a combination of nature and nurture. I mean, the more we learn, the more we realize is that there's really no such thing as predestination. So there's a very famous saying among psychologists and geneticists that genes can load the gun, but it's the environment that pulls the trigger.
Do you find, because there's a lot of Chinese words in your book, do you find like your mind sometimes just like it's overlapping, it's getting messy? Do you know where you stand exactly?
The language, I think I use it as a tool to bring out the culture. So I have no problem with using that in a book. I mean, we have a 140-year history here in Chinatown, New York, longer elsewhere. And if you examine some of the history of how the Chinese have survived in this country in the face of prejudice and racism and organized crime, I think you kind of tend to look at the psychology in a whole different cultural and socio-political context. Yeah, we're still exploring that today, and I'm really reaching back to some of the times in Chinatown that were very violent, and that's really where the Chinese detective comes from.
And if you think about the great books that really survive the test of time, well, their writers are incredible psychologists, because you have to understand human interaction, you have to understand the human condition really, and what motivates people, and you have to ask yourself really difficult questions. So I think that sometimes it's looking at the fictional characters and at their struggles that psychology can say, hey, you know, that character, what happened to him, maybe that's one of the factors that in resilience, let's study this. So I think that the interaction goes both ways, and oftentimes fiction can be more powerful.
As authors, we like when people find us fascinating, I think, because we find ourselves fascinating.
Well, when I first started writing these stories, I started writing, I was an English major in college,
Okay.
And at the time, nobody was writing these Chinatown stories. We were just getting these stereotypical presentations. So I started writing these vignettes. I knew I couldn't start out writing a 200, 300, 400-page novel, but I knew I could handle 20-page short stories, something like that.
Start.
And so in a way, writing about the lives of these immigrants and about gangsters, of course, but I didn't want to just write your stereotypical cop, crime, robber thing, but also to tell some of the sociology of the Chinese in this country and the things that they've gone through and how ultimately they come to victimize themselves. And so that's where the books really bring us into the culture. Great.
So you have 4 books. There's the Death Money. What is Death Money?
Death Money is based on a Chinese tradition. Every year when we go to the cemetery and we grave sweep our loved ones' tombstones, we also bring this death money. It's something we burn in a tin bucket. It's an offering to the gods of the underworld so that they're lenient, merciful to our loved ones down there.
Corrupted.
Other people will tell you that the death money is for your loved ones to play mahjong in the underworld. They can buy the things in the underworld commissary that will make their afterlives better.
Karin, Henry was touching upon authors that write 20, 30 books over like a short period of time, and you've been pretty prolific yourself. How is it to sustain that such a volume of an output?
What I do is I try to consider the story in front of me. What new things do I want to say about the characters? What new plot do I want to have? The murder is almost secondary, or the crime is secondary, because there's no way you can come up with a completely new crime.
I agree.
Sure, yeah.
What you can do is you can tell it differently with the characters, and you can show how the characters respond to it and how it changes people, because that's a really important theme in crime fiction is how does this change the detectives, the community, the family of the victim, what happens to them. And so really that's the starting point for me is I come up with this crime and I think, what is this going to mean for these characters who are in this book? A book always starts with a question for me. Why did this person do that? And if you look at any book that endures, whether it's Gone with the Wind or The Great Gatsby, the motivation is really this mystery of character. That's what keeps you reading the story. And these are also good crime novels. I mean, Gatsby has some really brutal murder. Gone with the Wind, Scarlett shoots the Yankee and talks about wanting to dance in his still warm blood with her bare feet, so I'm in good company, I think, when I write about crime and murder.
I mean, do you feel like you write story to use it as a social message for change for women, so talk about women?
Absolutely, and I'm very conscious writing in the genre that for many years women were completely marginalized and just there to either be saved or screwed by our hero and make him look good.
That's right. And
so I never want to write a book where the woman is saved in the end by the man and carried off. She may be carried off, but she's already killed the bad guy. And I just think that's an important social message.
So why did you choose a guy as your main character?
Originally, when I started my series in Grant County, I had 2 women characters and a male character who would switch the narration around. And so one of the women from that series is actually in the Will Trent series, and people just call it the Will Trent series, I guess because they like him. But I remind people he's fictional because he takes out the garbage without being asked and he washes dishes.
Perfect man.
Yeah, so he's like, this is how I get women to fall in love with him.
Do you have a plan on writing a crime novel?
I do have a novel that I'm editing right now. It's not a crime novel at all. I hate the term, but it's more just like a literary fiction, multi-generational family novel. And my next nonfiction book is about con artists. It's also crime related because the con is obviously one of the oldest types of crimes there is.
Is that a historical book? Or is it just
it's both historical and modern. It has a number of narratives, both current, where I use primary materials with current con artists, and victims, because in some ways I think the victims can be more interesting because no amount of intelligence and no amount of skepticism, no amount of knowledge or cynicism can really protect you in the end against being conned by someone who's really, really good.
Well, someone like Madoff, for
right,
example.
Absolutely.
So what's your interest in it at the personal level?
I think that it's a really fascinating question, this question of belief. Why do we believe the things that we do? And what makes us believe that? And on a personal level, I've never been conned that I know of in a big way, but I do, I question my beliefs all the time. Why am I thinking in a certain way? If you think about religion, from one perspective, it's one big con, the biggest con there is. From another perspective, someone who hears me saying that is going to say, that's sacrilege, literally. So I think that it's just a very fundamental question. But to answer it, the direct inspiration for the book was me sitting around watching David Mamet films. He's been obsessed with cons for decades, and I realized that this book doesn't exist, and it's important for it to exist because we should understand why this happens and why these sorts of things appeal to us. The stories are just fascinating too, going back centuries, but even to modern day, these are stories that I think need to be told from this perspective.
For you, when you say you don't quite believe what you believe, is that always because you can't find your center through that, or you don't know where to rest?
Instinctively, we believe. Our instinct isn't normally to distrust. Our instinct is to kind of believe. And the point that I try to make in my first book, about mindfulness, is that we don't even realize that we take all our thoughts for granted. We don't understand that we've already come to a conclusion. Before doing any analysis, we just think that is reality. Well, it's not. It's your own perception of reality. And if you were to hand each of us a piece of paper and have us recount the interview and kind of tell as much as we can about the experience and what we remember, just say, try to be factual, you're going to read 4 different stories. And some people who see them, they wouldn't know that we were even in the same interview unless, we have proper names and they'll be able to match it. But otherwise, it's this is 4 different events.
Yeah. What was striking about reading your books in one session, it's how Sherlock Holmes came across to me, and it felt like almost his flow in relation to this perception of reality, because he's completely blind to his own thinking patterns. He cannot see his voracious mind going like chasing after a snowball, like constantly trying to look for information, and so he does what he does. He gets bored and he shoots cocaine, and I found that dichotomy very interesting.
I think that's why he gets so much better after Watson enters the picture, because then he's forced to think about his mind, because Watson always asks really basic questions. And it's not just a great literary device, it's something that tells us a lot about how we think. If you think about the moment you have to explain an idea or a thought or a plot or anything to someone else, you have to think it out in a way that you never did, and you start seeing logical flaws that you didn't even realize were there, because in your head it made perfect sense, but then when you start saying it out loud, you're like, oh wait, I just made a logical leap there, I don't know if it actually exists. So what Watson does is he forces Holmes to think about his thinking, to say, wait, why did I come to this conclusion? Why do I think that she likes me? Why, do I think that he's a good guy or she's a bad guy? The more he does this, the more it also becomes a habit, to the point where he really does need Watson. And Watson even says at some point in the books that he'd become a habit to him, like his pipe or like his violin. And I think that's absolutely right. So Holmes has gotten used to speaking out loud and to really going through his thinking in a really systematic fashion.
Well, I was really thinking of Watson when I created a character who's his partner, and that's Faith Mitchell.
Oh, that's great.
And she's really pragmatic, and she figures out about his dyslexia, and so she's sort of the Watson to him, explaining things, making him talk it out, that sort of thing. So a lot of times will think something and Faith will articulate it.
I'm always amazed that how Karin, how people who have a number of books, the challenge really is how to make the next book better.
Yeah.
And as she says, it's not, you sort of almost wrap the crime around with the sociology and really try to tell the bigger picture of the people who are in the story and how it affects their world.
Yeah. But what's your background? Because you wrote about Chinatown. It's a very seedy Chinatown.
Well, I draw a lot of that from growing up around here and experiencing probably the most violent decade in Chinatown history. And
in the 80s?
With the Chinatown youth gangs and the tongs and the overseas triads, organized crime coming in, and I think it was Giuliani who came in and sort of cleaned up the mess and you know, just kind of drove everything underground. But I think, yeah, constantly you have to try to find a new sociological context. It's not just about the murder or the crime that somebody did, but you want to tell the stories that have not been told about people in Chinatown, that immigrant experience, kind of like blending the lives of ordinary immigrant people who are just struggling, you know, trying to get ahead, and kind of mix that up with the detective, the investigation, and the crime. So the driving force of it sometimes is the character, sometimes it's the social setting, but I think it's always a challenge when you have to find, you know, what am I going to write the next book about? You know, I already did the gang leader, he got killed. I already killed off this guy. I already, you know, the cop is going through all the changes culturally and, you know, and politically. And so that's the challenge, what to do next, and keep it interesting and keep it going.
Well, Karin mentioned that it was less about the crime but more about the character. So maybe the pieces become smaller and that it's not so operatic, but it's more muted in the action line.
Yes.
Do you find like you're going in that direction slowly, drifting that way?
Always.
Yeah.
Always. And I think the challenge is to, in every successive book, like how you're going to go deeper into this guy's psyche and the psyche of the neighborhood and the different type of criminals and what is the big story really about.
And I was amazed how much superstition plays a role in the Chinese culture. I mean, I knew about it because the casino is
I'm not sure. Are we more superstitious than
I don't know. You talk
Southerners
about it.
or
I think
Russians?
Yeah, I think you are. I think you are. I mean,
it seems that way.
Like 888, you know. But it's a lot about luck.
Luck?
Bad luck, you're number 4, you're dead. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, well, that's not to say that I don't think, you know, Chinese people, Asian people are superstitious. Yeah, yes, we are.
Yeah.
I mean, there are bad luck numbers, there are good luck numbers, there are, you know, things you don't do. You don't put your chopsticks a certain way on the table because it means death. You know.
Like what?
Which way? Which way? I want to know.
Well, if you have a bowl of rice, you never stick your chopsticks in like
you
this.
You never do it?
Okay,
No, you're
because
dead?
it represents like sticks of incense in an urn that you know, so a lot of little cultural elements like that. I love to draw upon that. I just don't like to repeat them. I mean, it's just like the death money. That was a new angle for this book. I just barely touched upon it in the past, and I said, well, this would be a great element because, you know, death money is not only that cultural element, but when we talk about crime, you know, what are the ill-gotten gains of that crime? You know, sometimes brings death to different people. So it could be seen as death money as well. So I'm trying to play upon the word, the phrase, and how to tie it into the cultural elements.
Karin, the sense of place is very important for you as well. It's from South Georgia. You tried to write about New York or what, Los Angeles, for example?
No, you know, I love where I'm from.
Oh, yeah, no,
I'm very proud
obvious.
of that. Yeah, and I think of my books as partly an education for people who have this idea that the South is, you know, all burning crosses and banjos and that sort of thing. It's really not. What I have done is, though, I've brought some characters who are from different parts of the world into Atlanta and written about them from an outsider's perspective. That's a lot easier for me. But in my next book, Coptown, I do have a character who is first generation Dutch and came over after World War II, and, you know, the family did. And so I've been really careful about that because I know my Dutch readers will pay close attention to things I got wrong. And I actually did a little poll on Facebook and said, do you mind that I'm doing this? And they said, as long as you don't have us in wooden shoes and hanging around windmills and speaking German, then it's good.
Eating cheese and Gouda, You are Russian-born, correct?
I was born in Moscow.
And the sense of place being dislocated like I am.
Yeah.
How does that impact you in your writing?
Well, I think that it makes me much more conscious of both place and language, in the sense that English isn't my first language. So, you know, it was really interesting to me earlier in the conversation when you mentioned that, you know, writers who Chinese isn't their first language, they wouldn't become writers. For me, it was the exact opposite. Because I've moved so much, so we came from Moscow to Vienna to Rome to the Boston suburbs, and now I live in New York. I'm really aware of how fluid both language and place are and how fragile they are. And so I think it makes me much more observant and much more kind of constantly aware of those choices. So I really feel like I need to pay attention, and I need to define myself in other ways. And I do really define myself as a Russian American writer, and that has become more and more important for me over time. Even though when I was younger, I hated that my name was so Russian, you know, Maria Konnikova. You know, I tried to call myself different things.
Well, I think the expression is life is a journey back to the roots.
Exactly, exactly.
And
so
you're still young, but it's still a circle.
Yeah.
My guests were Maria Konnikova, Mastermind, and How to Think Like Sherlock Holmes. I had Karin Slaughter with Unseen, a new book called Coptown coming soon, and Harry Chang, Death Money. Thank you very much, all of you, for being on Books du Jour.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
This program was brought to you in part by City Winery.